David Hartman, as all of you know, is one of the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. And this was an opportunity, we thought, that the best way to remember him was not to talk about him, but to do what would be most fitting tribute to him, which is to convene a Beit Midrash, by which we mean a Beit Midrash that doesn't have to look like a traditional association of Beit Midrash. And for those of you who have studied at the Institute or been to the Institute, you know that one of the defining features of the Institute's Beit Midrash, which is the heart of our campus, is that it's a Beit Midrash with windows and a Beit Midrash with a skylight. There's a magnificent video of about a 2-minute talk that David Hartman gave to students in our girls' high school in Israel, in which he says to them very adamantly from about 4 or 5 years ago, open the windows. To live as a traditional Jew in a traditional society today in the modern world requires you to open the windows, to allow the ideas of the outside to permeate the Beit Midrash, and to allow for the Torah that gets taught in this Beit Midrash to have a wider and deeper impact in the world around you. That a Beit Midrash that is completely closed off, that it dictates that Torah is only the province of that which is studied in this room and is not impactful outwards, is disrespectful both to Torah and to the world itself. And so we wanted to create that kind of Beit Midrash, to enter into a room at a UJA Federation and try to turn it into one, to bring in not only scholars and not only learners and not only ideas, but all of your instincts and your sensibilities of why a Torah study matters for the 21st century, for the big challenges that the Jewish people face, for the meaning of the modern state of Israel, and for all of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. This is what we wanted to try to do today. I want to start, though, with an admission or perhaps a confession. For David Hartman, who one of his great legacy was constantly surrounding himself with students, with dialogue partners, inviting the great theologians and philosophers of the world to constitute a circle where they would discuss ideas. I don't directly count myself as one of those students. I joined the Institute only in 2010, exactly the time that David Hartman was essentially retiring from his day-to-day work at the Institute. And so I didn't have the pleasure or the honor to be among his Yoshvei Beit HaMidrash, the ones who would sit among him in the Beit Midrash. And yet I have this weighty responsibility to carry the legacy of this institution here in North America, to represent its ideas, to represent its values, and to take the teaching of David Hartman and try to find broader audiences on the conviction that it matters. It deeply matters. And so what I felt was the only way I could introduce this event and to introduce David Hartman today was through learning a couple of his favorite texts, or perhaps the text that might be most closely associated with his iconic and iconoclastic style of teaching and learning. And so you have a packet in front of you, and I want to just start us off by learning together a couple of the classic, two of the classic David Hartman teachings. One from the Talmud in Yoma 69b, and the second, Genesis 18. For those of you who study in the Hartman Beit Midrash, I've come to learn that, like the old Jewish joke, you can just speak and say Genesis 18, and a lot of people nod their heads. If you don't know the text Genesis 18 offhand, they actually are here in the packet. So let's learn together a couple of texts, and then I'll open up today's program with a conversation with Professor Michael Walzer, who's here with me on the podium. Yoma 69b. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, why were they called the men of the great assembly? Looking back at the rabbis in the Jewish tradition, the leaders of the great Sanhedrin, the Anshei Knesset HaGadolah, that if you remember how the rabbis imagined the transmission of tradition from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to the prophets, and then to the men of the great assembly who become the architects of the rabbinic tradition that we ultimately inherit. And why are they called the men of the great assembly? Why are they given or attached this name of this greatness? What was so special about them at their moment in time? And that's going to be a critical piece of this teaching. At their moment in time and in their place of history, that they would be called with this name of being the men of the great assembly. Because they restored the crown of divine attributes to its ancient completeness. It sounds better in Hebrew. Shehichziru atara liyoshna. They brought the crown back to the place of its former glory. It's a beautiful phrase, tuchzar atara liyoshna, restore our glory to what it once was. And what did the rabbis imagine? Moses had come along and said, Ha'el hagadol hagibor vehanora, the great, powerful, and awesome God. right? Moses, who is associated not only with the authenticity of the prophetic tradition, the greatest prophet in our tradition, then the person most close to God, and the person who, by virtue of the fact of having led the Jewish people out of Egypt, saw firsthand what it meant for God to exercise great and powerful glory in the world. And so when Moses describes God as great, awesome, and powerful. Jeremiah had come along, who prophesied during the destruction of the first temple, and said, "Strangers are frolicking in his sanctuary. Where are the displays of his awesomeness?" Therefore he omitted awesome. In the book of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah describes God, it doesn't say awesome. It is Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor, the God who is great, who is exalted, who is strong, but not awesome. And why does Jeremiah have the audacity to say such a thing? To remove one of the divine attributes, the one that describes God's awesomeness, precisely because Jeremiah is not capable of seeing that in the world. I think the reason why this text spoke so much to David Hartman is that it asserts the place of the individual who looks at God in the world and must speak about God through a language of truth. To mirror or to parrot a truth about God that does not correlate to a human's experience of God is to speak falsehoods in front of God. This is the anchoring text to David Hartman's most recent and in some ways most important book, The God Who Hates Lies. The idea of the God who hates lies is that to speak falsehoods in front of God, to live in a world in a way in which you don't see that playing out, is to actually do an act of heresy. Just because the tradition speaks in one voice about God's awesomeness, if you are incapable of actually understanding God's awesomeness in the world, then it is falsehood for you. It is heresy for you to speak of God in those terms. And so Jeremiah, with great audacity, steps forward and says, I'm omitting this phrase in talking about God. Daniel came along, who lives during the Babylonian captivity following the first temple destruction, and says strangers are enslaving his children, also living through catastrophe and loss. And how can Daniel say in the same words as Moses, the great, exalted, awesome, powerful God? Where are the displays of his power? And so he did not say powerful in his prayer. He too, Daniel, like Jeremiah, embodies this capability of an individual living in time and saying, I must speak truth about God. I want to speak about God, but I have to allow my lived experience of the world to frame what I'm going to say about God. Otherwise, I too am standing in front of God and speaking falsehoods. The men of the great assembly came along and said, on the contrary, this is his strength, for he restrains his will, showing forbearance to the wicked. And these are the displays of his awesomeness, because were it not for the awe of the nations, the Holy Blessed One, how could one solitary singular nation survive among the nations of the world? And what do the men of the great assembly come along and do? They restore the original language to the prayer, right? The God who is great, who is mighty, who is awesome. Not because they're trying to pretend that the mightiness and the awesomeness is the same that Moses saw at the Red Sea, but because they have managed to reframe and reinterpret what mightiness, what awesomeness, what glory means in the light of the lived own experience. Again, they too have decided that to speak truth in front of God is to express in front of God only what they can actually say through the lens of their own lived experience and through reason is actually true. And yet, by doing so, in this context, they're actually restoring traditional language. As David Hartman writes in The God Who Hates Lies, there's two impulses driving the men of the great assembly here. The desire to be authentic to the tradition, to be faithful to the tradition. They want to say the words. And on the other hand, they can only say the words in front of God that they actually believe. This, I think, and perhaps I hope I've done it justice, tells a little bit of the story of what David Hartman tried to do with his Torah. I want to be deeply loyal to the tradition. I want to believe that it holds sway over me, that it is valuable, that I live within a chain of a tradition, and therefore we are the people within each generation who are going to hold on to this and pass it on to the next generation. But the idea that we would simply take it wholesale and pass it along to the next generation, ignoring the fact that so many of the experience of living as a Jew in a modern world come into conflict with its values. The idea that we would sublimate the instinct that not everything that you read in the book seems to be true to real life is heresy. It's not just foolishness, it's heresy. It's as though saying to God, your Torah is something that I'm not supposed to believe. If you look at the last page of your source book, this is expressed unbelievably beautifully in one of David Hartman's earlier books on Maimonides, Torah and Philosophic Quest. David Hartman says there are 4 options to reconcile the competing truth claims that come from living a life of tradition and being a person of reason. Right? The classic problem for the Jew in the modern world. What happens for me to both inherit a tradition and to feel combated by the reason? Right? Whether it's science, whether it's history, all of those things that make us believe that somehow the tradition is not right, it's not accurate, and it's not truthful. Right? 4 great options. I think we probably will recognize these in ourselves. Maybe we recognize them in our own developmental upbringing, or at least we can recognize them in others. The first classic option is insulation, and certainly many Jews in the world do this. I want to hold on to my tradition. I'm going to insulate myself from any critique that comes from the outside. Right? This is the theory that, for instance, would say, oh, the Bible says the Torah was created in 6 days, and lo and behold, there are dinosaur bones. How do I insulate myself against the critique that science and evolution provide? I'll say, God put the dinosaur bones there. Right? Insulation. Let me protect what is traditional by pushing out the legitimacy of any foreign critique. A second option is dualism, trying to pretend that you can hold on to these 2 impulses simultaneously, reason and tradition, in ways that are not supposed to have any impact on one another. Right? This is the theory that says that you turn off your brain when you go into shul, and you turn off your soul when you live in the world. Right? I'm going to hold on to these 2 things simultaneously, these 2 impulses, and they will not radiate against each other, and they will not destroy one another. A third is rejection. If I realize that the tradition is being challenged by all of these other stuff, I'm going to reject the tradition. And of course, this is probably the most commonly held view by Jews in the modern world. The tradition simply can't hold up to the weight of all of these critiques, science, history, and so on. And finally is integration. And this tells the story of what David Hartman's Torah was about, and we read as follows. He who lives within the way of integration will attempt to discover methods of making his tradition intelligible within a universal framework of intelligibility. To the degree that one can render one tradition comprehensible to all people, to that degree one can argue that the way of reason and the way of tradition are harmonious. Even those areas which manifest the particular lifestyle of the tradition will be interpreted in categories that are intelligible to all reasonable men. It's not simply enough, in other words, that we describe our tradition in ways that make sense to us. The tradition has to be described in ways that would make sense to anybody. Right? There's not a specifically Jewish form of reason or a Jewish form of science that should come along and justify the legitimacy of what it is that we study. It has to pass muster according to universal parameters of truth and reason. It is not enough that the knowledge claims of the tradition be in harmony with universal claims of knowledge. The way of integration strives to make the practice of tradition comprehensible and meaningful to all men. And if you read The God Who Hates Lies, maybe we'll edit that to all people. Right? The core premise of what the Hartman Beit Midrash should be, as modeled here in this idea of integration, is how do we hold simultaneously the value of the tradition on its own merits, the value of reason, and try to push them together in a way that makes the Torah speak in a language that it can actually work in the world. And if it fails to work in the world, there's something wrong with the tradition. That is the deep commitment of what David Hartman's Torah was intended to be about. Finally, the last text that we'll look at, which is right in the middle, which we'll just gloss over, from Genesis 18. Genesis 18 was, I think, the story of the Abraham with whom David Hartman could actually relate. Genesis 18, for those who don't remember, is Abraham in dialogue with God, or perhaps in vicious argument with God, about the legitimacy of the decision to destroy the Sodomites. And Abraham resists God's impulse to destroy the people simply because of iniquity. Remember, God has a bad track record on this. This was what God did to the people of the world, picked Noah as the person who would hold on to the human race and destroyed everybody else. Abraham stands up to God and says, will the judge of all the world not act justly? The Abraham who David Hartman identifies as the paradigm of the human being living in covenantal relationship is on one hand the person who feels obeyed, who feels the responsibility to obey God. Remember 6 chapters earlier, God had come along and said, follow me to this place, and Abraham said, okay, I'll follow you. But the conditions of my following you are that I am allowed to be in dialogue with you, I am allowed to push back against the decisions that you make to be amoral or immoral in the world, and I am going to negotiate with you the legitimacy of the outcome. The back and forth of Genesis 18, of Abraham in dialogue with God saying, will it be 50 people? Okay, 50 people. 25 people? Okay, and ultimately 10. Right, is the decision of a human being to say the covenantal relationship with God is one that empowers me to bring my moral instincts into dialogue. Just being in covenant with God does not mean I suppress my moral instincts. It's the opposite. That's why we are the people of Abraham and not the people of Noah. The people of Noah simply obey when God issues a fundamentally immoral decree. I'll destroy the world and I'll save you. The people of Abraham are the people who say, I obey you on condition that that process takes place within the framework of a moral discourse in which I am a participant. When Daniel and I were talking about what to teach today, one of the things you shared with me was it was always for your father about Sodom and never about the binding of Isaac. Couldn't relate to or couldn't handle the teaching of Abraham as the obedient character who simply absorbs the lessons of the binding of Isaac. Devastating. One of the things I love about the ability to say that is to be able to say, I can identify with a piece of this tradition, the one that can stand up to moral muster. Right? Many traditional Jews would say, I'm sorry, you can't separate. You can't have this part of Abraham and not that part of Abraham. One of the things I think that's so profoundly freeing about this Torah is the ability to say, how do we identify with the pieces of our tradition, the loyalty of the tradition that is still operates within a framework that allows us to identify with our moral vocabulary? What does it mean to be a genuinely moral person in the world who absorbs the tradition to the capability that their moral vocabulary will allow? This is what I want us to do today. This is the learning that we're going to do. On the big Jewish questions that the Jewish people face, it is so easy, outside of the context of a room like this, to either think in terms of technical solutions to these problems, to the challenges that the Jewish people face. It is easy to radically jettison our tradition as having nothing to say to the modern world because the challenges to that tradition are so strong. It is equally easy to close ourselves off from the modern world, as many Jews elect to do, and to simply live in total insulation. The radical step of trying to live in the tradition at the same time that we live within our own moral vocabulary and within our own reason is surprisingly radical. In some ways, it tells a story that the Torah of David Hartman might be needed more today than any time else before. What Torah do we need to see? What do we need to hear? And what Torah do we need to study in order to be Jews of this generation in time? How do we bring all of our critical faculties to bear in that study to make sure that we are both being loyal to the tradition we've inherited as well as being vocal and active Jews in the world? That's what I'd like to do today. I'm joined for a conversation to take this forward with Professor Michael Walzer, one of the leading political thinkers of his generation. Professor Emeritus of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, and I'm going to move down to this chair, to talk a little bit about what this actually means. What it means to produce a Jewish political tradition, which has been one of Michael Walzer's lifelong projects. And after I start with a few questions with Professor Walzer, we'll open up to a broader conversation.
Maybe before we start, I should just comment on Genesis 18 because there is something that David would have said that you didn't say. At the end of teaching that story, he would have asked, why did Abraham stop at 10? And that's the question that he taught us all to ask.
And what's your answer?
I don't have an answer. I don't think he should have stopped.
So I have a theory, but actually my father just asked me this question before we started. The same question, why stop at 10? And I wonder whether it actually has a great impact on what it is that we're going to talk about today, which is, to me, you don't stop at 10 because of the idea of minyan.
Right.
The idea of minyan, that you have 10, in order to constitute a community, you have to have 10 people, emerges from the notion that what does it mean to be a simple moral individual in the world? We have a paradigm for that. It's called Noah.
Yes.
When there's a moral individual in the world, I'd rather just extract that individual and destroy the entire world. In order to live as a moral agent in the world, you actually have to do it with other people. And what if 10 is the minimum standard by which you can actually act as a moral individual in the world?
Yes, maybe it is. Mostly we hope for more. We make do with 10.
Let me start off, Michael, by asking you a little bit to reflect on your experience of meeting David Hartman and studying at the Hartman Institute.
Right.
And then we can use that and come back around to the substantive conversation.
Yes, yes. In the early 1980s, I went to Israel with a manuscript. I'd been writing about the book of Exodus. And I was very nervous about doing anything with this manuscript. I was an Am Haaretz. What did I know? I had no Jewish education. I was a political theorist reading a text. I met David, and we talked. And he did two things. First of all, he gave me a license to write about the Bible as a political theorist. And secondly, he introduced me to Moshe Greenberg, a great biblical scholar, who sat and studied the book of Exodus with me before I wrote what became a book called Exodus and Revolution. So that was my first meeting with David. He gave me a license to write about the Bible, but he also told me I'd better study Talmud. And he invited me to the first of the philosophy conferences that he organized. The first one was in Canada, and there have been close to 30 now, and I've missed only one, and I will be going this June to another. And at the philosophy conferences, he brought together a remarkable group of people, religious and secular, and every possible kind of religious and every possible kind of secular. And we sat and studied Talmud. And for those of us who were secular political theorists, philosophers, he taught us how to read Talmud. He also taught us what parts of the Talmud could bear our reading, which was very important. And so we sat for, there were several of these meetings, and at one point I circulated a memo proposing a project for the philosophers, political theorists, on Jewish political thought. I thought it would be one volume, take 2 years. It's been almost 30 years. There will be 4 volumes. 2 are out. This has been a major project of my life and of the Hartman Institute. I should say that substantial funding has come from the Hartman Institute for this project, and all of the people involved have been people either studying at Hartman or attending these annual philosophy conferences. And this is a project that David inspired and supported and wrote a lovely couple of page preface to the first volume. And it is an effort to retrieve the political writings of Jews, from the Bible up to Israeli Supreme Court decisions, Zionist pamphlets, debates in the Knesset, to retrieve the whole tradition. Now, there was a Zionist belief that there was no politics from Bar Kokhba to Ben Gurion. There was just a vacuum of politics, no state, and so no politics. But that's wrong. And the political story of the Jewish exile is a remarkable story because we managed to survive as a nation with a law, with a legal system, without territory, without sovereignty, and most of the time without anything resembling coercive power. And that's a political achievement. That's a remarkable political achievement. And David taught us that that achievement had to be brought home it had to be valued because there was much to learn for the new state. The state needed to learn from the experience. And there are many, many things to learn, but one of the things which he talks about in his last book, one of the things that need to be learned is what it means to be a minority in other people's country. Once you, the experience of once you have a state, you need to remember, as the Torah says, remember that you were a stranger in Egypt. Remember that you were a stranger in Germany, in France, in America. And remember that when you consider how to treat the strangers in your own country. And that's just one.
Yeah. You said right at the outset that David Hartman gave you permission to read the Bible as a political. I want you to say another sentence on that. What does it mean to get permission to study the Bible that way? And I want you to talk also a little bit about the experience of studying Talmud outside of the context of theological assumptions. So when we were talking beforehand, you said, I'm theologically tone deaf, and yet you came to David Hartman to study Talmud with him. So I want to hear a little bit about what it means to study texts from a religious tradition with a total embrace of that theological tone deafness.
Yes. There was among some Zionists, like Chaim Nachman Bialik, a commitment to what he called the ingathering of texts, which had to accompany the ingathering of people. There is a Jewish nation, and historically that Jewish nation has been a religious community. The two today don't coincide. Many, many members of the Jewish nation are not religious at all, and many are religious in very different ways from the traditional ways. But the history of the nation belongs to all of us. And the history of the nation is, in significant ways, a religious history, and it is embodied in texts which are written from a religious perspective. Now, it's my conviction that there were secular Jews before there were secular Jews. Leo Strauss believed that Maimonides was an atheist. I don't think that's right, but he wasn't a standard Orthodox Jew either. So there is a culture, there is a history which belongs to us. In Israel, that history and culture has been claimed by a segment of the Jewish people, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, who claim to have a monopoly. It's theirs, and it's not ours. And they are the authoritative interpreters of this tradition. What David told all of us is that's not the case. The tradition doesn't have a pope, doesn't have an authoritative interpreter or a set of authoritative interpreters. We can be interpreters if we want to be. you have to pay a price, you have to study. But the tradition belongs to all of us, whatever our theological convictions or absence of them. It's ours. And if you study the political history as a political theorist, if you read these texts, there is political wisdom in them. And again, it's ours. We can lay claim to that if we are prepared to engage with it. Our engagement, the engagement of a secular political theorist, has to be a critical engagement. I came to believe that the negation of the Galut, that Zionist project, was in part a mistake. There were things that had to be negated in Galut Jewry: the submissiveness, the passivity, the fearfulness. If you read the literature of Shtadlanut, which we will be collecting in Volume 4 of the Jewish political tradition, it will make your skin crawl. The court Jew, the intermediary who ran back and forth, who tried to pacify the Goyim, who kowtowed, who bribed, who begged. There's much of Galut Jewry, the experience, that had to be rejected, but there's much that had to be retrieved and incorporated into an ongoing Judaism, ongoing Jewishness. And that's a project that we can all engage in.
You know, let's talk about the modern state of Israel a little bit. This is one of David Hartman's great commitments in a lot of his writing, was the belief that the modern state of Israel represented a huge opportunity for the Jewish people to play out Jewish values in practice and in action, to kind of re-experiment with those aspects of our tradition related to sovereignty, power, authority over others, authority over the public spaces that we control, and to kind of reawaken. You know, you talked about reawakening the Shtadlanut text, but in this case it's actually reawakening the book of Deuteronomy, right? Of what happens when we're actually in control of our own territory. There are signs of what you're talking about within the state of Israel, of a reclaiming of a Jewish identity by Israelis in the idiom or in the framework that they can actually use. And I think a good example of this was a very widely circulated video by the new Knesset member, Ruth Calderon, which many people saw. It was translated by the Jewish Week into English and then ran in English in New York, in which she reads a Talmudic text as a Knesset member. Not the one I would have chosen, but she reads a Talmudic text. And there was a lot going on, including a textual debate that she undertook in the middle of her speech by the speaker of the Knesset, who was a Shas ultra-Orthodox Knesset member, who was quibbling with her about her reading, which was already kind of a validating of her as a reader of the text, just a disagreement on the text itself. And of course, at the end of her speech, of trying to talk about essentially this project of bringing the embrace or the reclamation of Jewish values by secular Israel, she acknowledges her debt to David Hartman, the Beit Midrash, in which was so formative to her. And then at the same, so there are obviously voices and a language within Israeli society that suggests a claiming of the tradition, not as this is a good extracurricular activity for Jews to do, but this is the canon of what it means to be an Israeli. And at the same time, there are obviously pessimistic signs of the ways in which there are plenty of Jews within the Israeli political establishment who are perfectly comfortable with the stuff of the Jewish political tradition around authority, and don't need to be muted in any way by Jewish values. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the ways that Jewish values are informing the modern state of Israel and its political discourse?
Right now, I'm not optimistic at all. I don't know. I do not think that for example, that the response to Sudanese refugees crossing the Sinai and trying to enter Israel by the Minister of Interior, who said, "This is a white country." I don't think that was a response in tune with Jewish values. I don't think that the price tag attacks on Arabs in the West Bank is an example of Jewish values. I think that things like that can be criticized on the basis of moral philosophy. You could criticize much Israeli behavior these days from a purely secular standpoint, without any engagement with Jewish texts. But there is a special force. We engage emotionally when we say, this is not what it means to remember that you were slaves, that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Israel has plenty of critics in the world, and some of them fair and many of them unfair critics. But there is a specifically Jewish criticism, which I think is very, very important. A criticism of, you get a lot of it in a criticism of what Judaism has become in Israel, which is a theme of the God who hates lies, but also a criticism of what of the politics of the state in Jewish terms.
And let's turn back to this side, because if this conversation was taking place in Jerusalem, it would have one side of impact. What is North American Jewish political identity supposed to become? Right? I mean, what is, if we have this vision of what, of how a Jewish, if you have a vision, the books have a vision of sourcing Jewish tradition for the best of its values on topics that the Jewish people are finally reawakening themselves to. Are we simply kind of the observers and archivers of this tradition for the last 2,000 years in order to help shape that project? Or what's the American Jewish side of a political tradition?
Well, look, what used to be called the Jewish question has found two very different answers. Sovereignty in the Middle East and citizenship in the democratic states of the West, particularly here in the United States. So we have reproduced Palestine and Babylonia. We have Israel and American Jewry, essentially that. And I would hope for a kind of competitive emulation. Let's see whose Talmud is better, Babylonia or Palestine. Let's see who can produce a greater Jewish scholarship, philosophy, literature. For myself, I would bet on Israel. But I think it's very important for American Jews to do everything that we can do to not just to sustain a Jewish life here, but to produce greatness here. In this conference, some of us developed the idea, which David encouraged, some of us who weren't observant Jews, of what we called speculative halakha. The way the Catholic bishops will, here in this country, will deliver a statement on nuclear deterrence or on social justice. derived from Catholic moral theology. It's a statement addressed to all Americans. It enters the democratic discussion, but it is rooted in a particular moral conception. And we thought, why can't the Jews do that? Why can't there be, undoubtedly we couldn't produce what the bishops produced, a single statement. we would have several such statements, but that would be good. Drawing on the Jewish experience and halakhic teaching, but with a sense of engagement with the world. Here is a Jewish view on how to fight a war, or here is a Jewish view on how to levy taxes or support a welfare system. And I think that that is a prospect that should lie ahead for halakhic Jews and for non-halakhic Jews to mine the tradition for insights about how to live here and now, and to broadcast what we find.
I'm going to open up to questions for Professor Walzer.
Your use of the phrase speculative halakha is striking, which brings to mind current efforts to do that. For example, the recently proposed Heksher Zedek, which says that not only should the meat be kosher, but the whole process, the whole social, economic process of those who work to produce the kosher meat should also be held to standards of justice, parity, fairness. Thank you.
Yes, the young people engaged in that project sponsored a discussion at Princeton University in which I participated. So I think it's a very, very good project. And once they have said it, you wonder why nobody said it before.
I think you just knocked out a hero of mine. Yeshayahu Leibovitz was a hero of mine, and he, as I read his writings, thought that by making a Jewish state, it would be trivializing Judaism. But I think maybe what he could have done, what he could have said, was exactly what you're saying now. Make a Jewish state a light unto the nations. Bring out the mind values that we've inherited over the years. Is there any way to get to Leibovitz's philosophy through that?
It's important to say that these two men agreed that the state of Israel was not a divine creation. It was not an act of God. It was an act of labor Zionism. It was a creation of human beings, political activists and even militants. The victory in the Six-Day War was not divine victory. It was a human victory. What David believed was that these human triumphs required a religious response. And Leibovitz was unclear as to whether that was true. But I think David was right. It required a religious response, not in the sense of a demand on the political system of the new state, a demand that the new state enforce some set of halakhic rules, but a response by the Jewish people living in this state. How should they live in a sovereign state after living for almost 2,000 years in states that were not theirs, not ours? There had to be a religious response. So you needed a halachic response to the fact that there was now a Jewish state in which Jews would have to run the fire department and the police department on Shabbos and the hospitals and the army and everything else. And that had to be thought about, and Jews would have to figure out when to fight and how to fight, which had always been a Goyish project. So there had to be a halachic response, as I think Leibovitz wanted very early on in his writing about these questions. But what had to be resisted was any kind of turning the state into an idol, or the land into an idol. I mean, there are and you had to make choices also about the state and the land. I mean, there are now Jews on the Israeli right who think the land is more important than the state and are willing to put the state at risk rather than give up the land, which seems to me a mistake, a religious mistake, I guess, since it seems to have religious motivation. And Leibovich's warnings after the triumph in '67 are, you cannot forget them.
Yeah, I mean, Leibovich, and I would just add one sentence to it. I think Leibovich and Hartman are in dialogue with each other, implicitly and explicitly, through a lot of their writings. I think it's very hard to imagine ultimately harmonizing the views, because I think Leibovich was so concerned about any way in which the state would represent or embody halakha, right? It's not delegitimizing the state to say it needs to retain its secular identity in order to stay separate from the world of halakha, which is entirely about obedience to a divine command. And the anxiety about separating them is so extreme, it's hard to imagine a reconciliation with David Hartman's views, which, while preserving a difference between the world of halakha and the world of the state, demanded, as you said, this ethics of response. We need to mount a religious response to the state of Israel in order for it to be within the kind of the canon of Jewish ideas that matter. And so there does remain a certain space between the two thinkers.
So after Ruth Calderon spoke, the Haredi press responded with tremendous anxiety. She's speaking our language and she's using it against us. So now that secular and Haredi Israelis are speaking the same language, do you see any chance for them to actually have a productive conversation? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Every Israeli has an interest in the education of all Israeli children because they are going to grow up to vote in Israeli elections. And that means that the state has a right to impose a set of texts, a set of subjects, and to require that everybody study those subjects. And I think that would be, and to refuse to fund schools that don't study those subjects. And to find ways of making sure that the subjects are not taught with a wink and a nod, but are taught seriously. That seems to me to be critical for if there is to be a common citizenship and what Aristotle has this notion that in a democracy the citizens are friends. If Israeli citizens are to be friends, then they have to have some common knowledge, some way of some subjects about which they can talk to each other.
Eric?
Yeah, I have a question about the text that Yehuda that you taught earlier on about the idea of the way of integration as a model for the study of Torah, And I wonder if you seek to make particular Jewish teachings intelligible within a universal framework, do they then become superfluous? If you translate what's particularistic and you might say essential about Jewish teachings into a universal language, why have them to begin with? Why not just take the universal teachings that say much the same thing?
Look, in Hinduism, in Islam, in Judaism, there are many, many feminists, religious feminists, working to understand, to reinterpret the religious traditions in ways that make it make the tradition compatible with gender equality. They're working very, very hard. And they are producing, in our world, they are producing quite remarkable rereadings of Talmudic and biblical texts. Now, why are they doing that? The arguments for gender equality are universal arguments. Why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because if they are to persuade the people they need to persuade, they have to engage with the feelings of those people and the commitments of those people and the history, the biographies of those people. And universalism it can be a regulative idea, but it isn't. It doesn't make that engagement possible.
I'll give you my answer, if you want my answer too, which is two things. One, to build off of this, right? There's no more overly fetishized distinction in Jewish life than the one between universalism and particularism, as if these are two orbits that have no relationship to one another, or at least, as though they are different choices that one might make intellectually or educationally, as opposed to what we intuitively know to be true, which is in order to make a compelling universal argument, you have to be able to source the traditions from within your own particularistic world. There's no such thing as a universalist who lives outside of the world of their own particular identity, family, and community. And the most profound universal statements are those that originate from a validating of my own particularistic community, and then therefore a capability to radiate outwards lessons of the world. But I would put it slightly differently, which is an authenticity argument, which is I'm starting from a place, right? And I think this is David Hartman too. This is my tradition. I want it to matter, and I want it to matter not just by saying what matters is a conversation that takes place out of the tradition, but because I want to be able to hold these two things simultaneously, to say, this is my tradition, I own it as much as anybody else, right? We have to own it as much as anybody else. And at the same time, if we're going to own it as effectively as it should be owned, it has to speak to the real challenges that we're dealing with in the world. So it starts with the assumption of this tradition matters to me. And now how do I make it intelligible and alive in order to be able to compete in a world of ideas?
And I think he was right. I am a secular Jew who goes to shul every Shabbos. Why? Well, that's where the Jews are. And slowly, my wife and I have begun to walk to shul on Shabbos. So David had some insight into what a commitment to a people, to a community entails.
Thank you, Michael, for your insights today.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.